it was just an I'm done. And this is the most permanent way I can think of to get this endless thinking about hoarded things to stop. And I wasn't worried about what could happen. I don't. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the afterlife. The thought of eternal darkness was very pleasant to me at the time. My name is Gordon Corsetti. I live in Roswell, Georgia, over in the United States, and I am now 33 years old. I work in the utility industry, which has been a massive career shift from my previous work in adult education and learning and development. And I am a depressive, and I live with generalized anxiety disorder, and I've also experienced several different attempts to end my life by suicide by different methods in my earlier 20s. Part of that due to my major depressive disorder, and part of that due to some improper use of going off of medications without doctor supervision, mainly due to my own stubbornness and quite frankly, stupidity. So a lot of what I try to do now in my work with Mental Agility, which is my organization that I blog from, I write from, I do these interviews from, is to share information about mental illness and about the treatment for mental illness that people may not be familiar with, or if they are, they're not familiar with or comfortable talking about it. And so I like to say that I can give people some words, some verbiage that they can better understand what it is that somebody with mental illness may go through, but also how they can talk about suicide, which is a very scary topic, but it's something that if we put the frightening thing to the side, we don't have to be scared of it in that discussion, and then we can find some practical solutions to help reduce some human suffering, either on a global setting or on an individual setting if you're taking care of somebody that means something to you. So a lot of what I'm doing now in my 30s is just trying to raise awareness on suicide prevention efforts, both in my hometown, my state, the U.S., and globally where I can. And also doing this as a continued therapy for me. It allows me to be very introspective and try to figure out what's going on in my mind at a particular moment and try to digest and understand that. And then hopefully I put out some useful information to some other folks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gordon. I know that's very helpful, actually. As you were talking there, I was thinking about my kind of how people who don't often deal with suicidal thoughts or anything like that, how they think about people who do, and there's almost a sense that you're always walking on eggshells, or you're not you don't want to do or say anything that might trigger a response in someone who's going through a period of depression or experiencing suicidal thoughts, and sometimes how that manifests is just silence. So instead of actually engaging the person and speaking to them, and it's almost a sense that you don't have the language to discuss these sorts of things, and so I think that's really important work that you're doing.
I appreciate that, and it's one of those things of suicide is one of the few topics across the human experience globally that is not talked about, because it's fear inducing, and it's one of those things where I've joked that there's a fear, I think, that people are like, oh, if I talk about this, they're going to do it, or if we talk about it, it's going to put thoughts in my head, and I don't want to deal with that myself. Like I'm like, no, that's not how this works. It's you can't catch suicidal thinking, nor can you inspire somebody to action by your choices of words or your behaviors. However, there are things that you can do that are much more helpful than are generally done. That's one of the helpful things that have come out from. I'm not sure so much on the resources nationally in the UK, but certainly in the US we have the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the North American NAMI, which has standards and recommendations based off of years now of studies that say, like, here's some of the more recommended ways you can speak to somebody about suicide, and then here's some practical interventions if you're really worried about somebody's safety. So I try to find myself a little bit more on the preventative side of that, and how, because the intervention side is pretty well covered in the literature. Now it's how much what can we do well ahead of a crisis, and giving people either who are experiencing those thoughts or who are caring for somebody with those thoughts, giving them more resources to recognize what may be going on before that person makes a fatal decision.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. And I guess for want of a better term, as you mentioned there, this idea of catching suicidal thoughts. How did this all start for you? What was the genesis of this your anxiety and depression?
Uh, so I'm a poster boy for the genetic things that can go wrong mentally. As far as, because I've had a lot of hosts of things like, was there an abuse thing? Was it a difficult childhood? Did something like really dramatic happen and this was the result? I'm like, no. I'm, white straight male in a upper middle class family in the United States with a private school education, and no, many cards stacked in my favor. Um, just not my genetics. Along the maternal side of my family is a lot of history of mental illness, bipolar disorder, anxiety. Some folks who were committed to institutions or asylums back when that's all they did with people, because you wanted to hide those folks and not really acknowledge their existence, lest you catch that problem, or really have to acknowledge that to your friends. That was the deal. But no, I was 15 or 16 in high school when I started really noticing that I was having. I called them whispers. I wasn't actively hearing thoughts or voices that were in mine. It's just I was noticing some very odd thoughts, and they started pretty innocuously, very bland, of just like, it's just, I'm so tired this morning, I don't want to get up, and then that morphing into questions about my performance or my behavior, or my interactions or lack of interactions with my peers at that time, of people don't like me, and then that graduates into I don't really like myself, and that continued to build and build until I was about 18 in my senior year of high school, where I spent the summer before that senior year and most of that school year planning to end my life in a very specific way, and just waiting for a moment to make that happen. It was an intervention from a friend that prevented me from doing that, but I didn't actually get a formal diagnosis or actual treatment until well into college. And then that precipitated my experiences with going on to several SSRIs and SNRIs, so several different types of antidepressant medications, and and that was just something I struggled with deeply. And so I didn't like the side effects. I didn't like the idea that I had to be on medication to feel good. I felt that that was something that had to happen internally. So there was a lot of judgment, a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, just from me, not from other folks around there, or too much of that. And so I would cold turkey medications, and then once all the good feeling, good chemicals got out of my system, I would nosedive, and I tried to end my life, and then I wound up in a hospital, and we'd just repeat the cycle. And that was most of my early 20s. Was trying to figure out, doing a lot of talk therapy, but for the most part dealing with these giant peaks and valleys of not respecting, one, the power of these medications, but two, rebelling against the fact that I have a mental health disorder.
You were talking there about this experience in high school where you had planned pretty much the whole year how you were going to end your life. I think I saw an interview with you somewhere else where you mentioned that it was a lacrosse teammate, and he simply asked, "How can I help?" And those four words being so powerful to, I guess, kind of pull you back from the brink of what might have otherwise been a tragic situation. How did that conversation save you, essentially? What was it about those four words that kind of pulled you back?
So I was sitting it was after practice, and I was sitting on the back of my Jeep, and I had the hatch open, and I'm just sitting on the back, and I'm pretty sure I had like this 1,000-yard stare just off into the distance. And something had happened in practice, and I'm like, no, I'm doing this. So my thought was, I'm just going to wait for everybody in the parking lot to clear out. I'm going to wait for it to get dark, my plan, as it were, was to have a traffic accident that was only going to involve me, so that my family wouldn't really see what all was going to go down. Right? They have a very understandable excuse of a young driver, young inexperienced driver, taking a sharp turn over a high, cliff, basically in the dark, and that was going to be the reason being. So uh, I'm just waiting for the right time, and my friend Ben is walking through the parking lot, kind of sees me just looking out into nothing, comes up and asks, how could, he read that something was up, right, body language wise, whatever the vibe I'm putting out, and he said, how can I help? And that I don't recall actually saying anything, and that in and of itself is also an answer. And so he just kind of sat down with me, and I think eventually I disclosed what I was thinking, and then he did the next best thing was not leaving me alone. So we wound up. He was like, "Well, hey, McCoy's moving. Do you want to go help him? Pack up some bags?" I go, "Yeah, sure." And in the back of my head, I'm going, "I could still kill myself after we do that." So I'm just delaying this. That's fine. And so we moved stuff for like an hour or two, and I'm a little distracted. Right, I'm still very much not in a good mental space, but I'm further away from that point of action than I was previously. And then he commits. He's like, "Hey, you're gonna be able to get home?" I'm like, "Yeah, I will." He's like, "Well, call me when you get home." I'm like, "All right." And do you want to go to the therapist at school tomorrow? I was like, "Yeah, I can do that." So that was my first introduction. And then the therapy was the next day, seeing the school counselor. And I was always operating under this assumption from that interaction that Ben just kind of naturally found the right words to say, and that like just a human to human connection, saw something was up, and cool. I learned 3 years ago after I gave a talk to my old high school on this exact subject, and I'm speaking with the teachers at a luncheon about ways they can recognize some things and help their students de-stress even in class. And he mentions that he was involved in the peer leadership group our senior year, and like 2 weeks before he and I had that interaction, the peer leaders met with somebody who was like it was like a proto suicide prevention resource talk that they were given, and like here's the basics of what we think we know of how to deal with somebody in this type of crisis situation. And so that to me, I learned that 15 years after the fact. And I go, wow, that speaks to how powerful education can be in this, and that you don't have to have a medical degree or a license for psychiatric care or therapy to be able to buffer somebody through the worst of what their brain is doing to them.
And I think that's so important to acknowledge that, as I mentioned before, this whole idea for individuals who don't have to live through these experiences of intrusive thoughts, that if they do notice something, that they can say something, they can offer help, they can intervene in some way, because that could save someone's life.
Absolutely. I mean, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, their logo is a life preserver. So a life preserver doesn't do anything but just stay there. It provides a baseline level of stability in a lot of chaos, and then that allows time for more professional, educated individuals to now assist that person. So the idea here is be a life preserver.
So you mentioned that these thoughts and feelings started around 15, 16. Did you were you aware of any effects that was having on your friendship groups or your family as you were going through these this turmoil?
I mean, looking back on it, certainly in the moment, what I recalled was I've always been my folks would say I'm an old soul. Right? So when I was in high school, I didn't really have a lot of friends who were my own age. I had better conversations with teachers and more interesting ones in my estimation. I wasn't really interested in the stuff that most high school teen boys are interested in, and with the exception of girls, sure. but but for the most part, I'm just like I'm sitting here. I'm like I can't get into the school spirit. I don't really care about college stuff where I'm going there. I don't like with the exception of the sport that I'm playing. I'm not. I just wanted to read my books and be left alone. Like that's really what I wanted to be. And I trained jujitsu and kickboxing at the local gym, and my friends there were like all north of 30, some of them in their 60s. And so those were the people that I actually connected with after school. And that's what I lived for going through all this, because that was my one place where I didn't really feel these depressed thoughts. But yeah, I eventually solidified a persona of, nobody really likes me in high school, so I'm just going to be a loner through this. And part of that was I don't think anybody's going to understand what exactly I'm thinking about. But then and again, this doesn't match what I just said. I was under a misapprehension um, that due to this knowledge that I lacked. Like I'm sitting here going like, well, I'm going through puberty. This is a natural human thing. I'm having these thoughts. I thought having these depressed thoughts was a natural consequence of growing into an adult. So I had this weird assumption where, yes, not only nobody could know what I'm thinking about or feeling, right? That was one thing that wasn't true. And the other thing that was overriding that was everybody else, I thought, was having the exact same thoughts that I was having. They were just dealing with them so much better. Like these are people who actually can seem to be able to smile and aren't carrying around a sack of 1,000 pounds of rocks on their back, and their studies are good, and they actually seem to be awake in the morning, like and all these things that I could barely make happen by the skin of my teeth. And I'm like, well, I can't say that I'm having these thoughts that are scaring me and are frightening me because, well, everybody else is dealing with them. So I, I'm weak in that sense, and that's not something I wanted to admit at that time.
Yeah. No, I as you were talking about this, I guess I'd frame it as a lack of motivation to continue living. I can certainly relate to that. I have had periods in my life, particularly my early 20s, where I don't know. It's this really strange thing where you just don't. You find that you just don't have the energy to get up and go to work. And then you miss a day and you're like, oh crap, I've missed a day of work. And now that reinforces the idea that, okay, well, I can't go to work now because I've missed a day, and then I'm gonna have to explain myself, and and before you know it, 2 weeks have gone by, and you're AWOL, hiding somewhere, wallowing in just all of these thoughts of feeling terrible about yourself, just not really understanding why. It's almost feeling as though you're self-sabotaging without really knowing why or how it's come to be that way. It's a very lonely place to be. And as you were talking there about this almost kind of isolation within your thoughts and your feelings, feeling as though, well, who would want to hear this stuff? And even if I do tell them, like, their response is going to be like, well, just, buck up and,
Yep.
get through it. Pull your britches up.
Suck it up. Other people have it worse. Come on, look at all the things you have to be grateful for, and all these things, which unfortunately hit and that's where I think I've probably grown just more in my own personal understanding, but also in dealing with my own brain. Is those questions, those observations that we are afraid of hearing from the people we care about, or even from the people we don't care about, which are judgment things, they're all based on logic. I know there are people starving in India. I know that I've never had dysentery. I know that I've got a lot of privileges that are just based on where I was born and the time I was born in. Like, it's better now to be where I'm at in this time than it would have been even, say, 200 years ago. It just is, right? So great, and but none of that touches the emotional core of what you're feeling or what you're not feeling. It's just this logic stuff which sits on the surface of that, and we are not, as much as we like to think, logical, rational beings. We don't live in that space only, right? We it's a combination of this emotional stuff, and that's the messy side of things. And that's for a long time what I tried to push away and rely solely on logic, which then, oddly enough, got me into these endless judgments about myself, which predisposed me even more to thinking about suicide. So it was the acceptance of the fact that I am an emotional creature and I'm a social creature that took the vast majority of my 20s to accept on that fact. And what I try now to teach younger people and their parents of You know what? Missing a day of school doesn't mean that now you're going to fail your junior year. So you're going to start senior year late. So you're not going to get into a good college. So now you're not going to get a new job. And so now you're going to be broke, homeless, living under a bridge. Like these are conversations I've had with young people who are that worried. Like they go to that consequence as a result of getting a B minus on a test. So I'm just trying to widen their emotional understanding, and again give them more of the words they can use to describe things that they, just by virtue of their age, are not familiar with and think are foreign to the human experience, when really these things have been experienced millions, if not hundreds of millions of times before by every person who's ever lived.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so you were talking there before about going into your early 20s and finally getting diagnosed. And we mentioned before on the call that we had previously, I hear a lot of people sometimes talk about when they are going through an illness, or they've got symptoms of something and they haven't been diagnosed with it yet, and all of the trauma of feeling as though almost, I guess, kind of, is something really wrong with me, and not really being sure if something's wrong with you, or this is just what life is supposed to be like. You're just experiencing it and being less able to cope with what's going on, whereas everyone else can. But then finally getting a diagnosis and feeling, actually, you know what, now that I have a name to something, I can put that in a box and say, okay, now I can deal with it. Now I can understand how to tackle this thing, because it's something clearly defined, and I know what I can do with that now. Did you have any of those experiences finally getting a diagnosis?
I wish. I was pissed. That's. I mean, I was furious. Not only okay. Yeah, I walk that back a little bit. It's like it was nice to be able to, like, okay, yes, have a name for this thing. And I'd heard of depression before, but now it's like it's very different when it's the thing that is within you, and you're trying to work that into your identity as well. That takes some doing. But I was angry, and I got more angry as I, especially after the first hospitalization that I had. I was maybe 23, 24, and just the the inability to leave a building and get being checked on every 15 minutes during the day through the night, not being able to shave, not being able to wear shoes with shoelaces, having to do these weird group therapy sessions with a whole bunch of folks who equally, you know, when you're in a recovery center right away from either suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, or a drug overdose of some kind, nobody wants to be there initially. So everybody's just pissed off and in denial and very, very just the guard is up, and so uh, those feelings of anger and frustration and ultimately it was bottled up by fear and a lack of knowledge. And I'm sitting here going, just like, you know what, this is completely unfair. I've done everything right in my life. I tried to do all the right things, and now I'm running into this wall. I didn't ask for this. Like, what is the point of this? And so now I'm trying to figure out what the giant cosmic plan here that I can justify these horrid experiences for, and I couldn't divine what those could be. So I'm like, screw it. This is all bullshit. And I just got progressively more and more angry, and that led to more and more poor decisions with medication, but also more poor decisions in terms of coping mechanisms that I would wind up uh, choosing to use that were better in the short term, certainly, but not so great for long term health. But no, it took me a long time before I started getting curious about the psychology, my own personal psychology, and then just psychology in general. And it was finally when I started getting really curious about what's going on between my ears, from a purely biological standpoint, that I wanted to, that I was like, all right, I can. This was maybe my mid 20s, where I'm like, I can take myself and my experiences out of it, and I can examine them like I would be examining somebody in a research study or a case study. and that might have been like the beginning trajectory of me getting the to the healthy mindset that I now try to maintain.
Yeah. No, I completely hear that. And I think often it's so easy to forget or not acknowledge the fact that when we think about mental illness, it's there's almost an intangibleness about it, for want of a better word. So it's, when you've got a cold, you've got a fever, you might be coughing, people can visibly see that you're unwell, and then they'll respond to you and help treat your needs. And I suppose you also recognize that actually this is maybe you might have some water and have a little bit of a rest. But I think when it comes to mental illness, because of the almost ethereal nature, or at least how it's framed sometimes, it almost seems a little bit as I don't know, I suppose less of a real thing and more of just a response to the world around you, and so this misnomer that it's you're just not resilient enough.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not strong enough. You're not capable enough. You didn't have enough correct formative experiences. Your parents weren't strict enough. They were too strict. They were there. So there's all this, and it's contradictory information, and it's all based on a fundamental lack of understanding of the fact that it's a lack of respect for the fact that we are biological animals. We are ultra social primates, and that the brain, so far as we know, we haven't found a more complicated organ anywhere else. And the human brain especially, it's the most complicated thing that we know about. And we're barely even scratching the surface, and neuroscientists will admit this, of just like, well, there's so much more that we haven't even figured out what we don't know yet. And that's what makes it exciting. I'm like, to me, it makes very little surprise to me that when a brain breaks down, there are stuff that happens downstream in terms of behavior and thoughts that is going to be catastrophic. And so it's there's only so many ways that the heart can fail, right? And then that shows up in very specific ways that we understand. But we've been dealing with those types of things for so long, and the treatments for those, the treatment of mental illness has been, again, I go back, if 400 or 500 years ago, if I was presenting with these same things, some physician, right, would be drilling a hole in my head to release the demons. And, and if they didn't release enough of the demons, they drill another hole in my head. And so we're in the very early stages of learning about this stuff from a purely scientific point of view. But then we're in the even earlier stages of understanding the fact of just, this is what happens when brains break down, and here's how we can accept this as a society and try to be more human to the people who are dealing with it.
Indeed. Earlier you were talking about this deciding of rebelling against the medication and feeling as though, well, I'm better now, or I feel better than I have done for a very long time, therefore I'm good, I don't need to take the medication anymore. I just explain that a little bit to me, because I think I guess I'm a little bit of a I shy away from taking medication, not because I have any kind of like conspiracy theories or whatever, but like, I guess I'm a typical man in that regards. Unless I feel like I'm on my deathbed, then I don't need to take anything. But yeah, like, is what's going through your mind when I guess that you've got a diagnosed condition, you've had a lot of difficulties up to this point, and now the medication seems to be working. Is it that, oh, I'm cured, so no need to take medication anymore, or
I never had the thought of like, I'm cured in that, because even all the doctors, the psychiatrists are very upfront of just like, this is a lifetime thing. Like, we don't have a cure for this yet. Maybe we'll discover one tomorrow, but for right now, this is what the medication does is, and when I explain to young people and their parents, is it gives space. It's very difficult to make good, concrete, rational decisions when you're under stress, and that's all a person in a severe depression, a severe state of mania or depression, in the case of bipolar disorder, or those who are severely anxious. It's difficult to make good long-term decisions in that state. And so, from my experience, what these medications do is it gives you a little bit of buffer time between all those thoughts where you can work to calm yourself down and put yourself in a place to make better decisions. And what's happened for me is I started off on Paxil, right? Fairly common SSRI that people will be put on, and eventually got the medication dosage bumped up until it was at a therapeutic dose for me. And then I cold turkeyed it. And what happened for me was when I would go off and just stop taking the medication, because more that I was more pissed off that I had to take it and that I was dealing with side effects, predominantly weight gain. I'm 5'10". In college, I was 160 pounds, maybe. At the in my mid 20s, I topped out at 195 when I was on a combination of Lexapro, Abilify, and I can't even remember the other medication right now. But I was taking all those things that were just doing drastic things to my system. So I was dealing with, I either couldn't sleep depending on the medication I was on. I'd sleep too much. I had to figure out when to take the medication to be able to do that. So that's messing me up. Now I'm having performance issues at work. Then I'd have performance issues in bed because several of these things they can't. A lot of these medications for the male physiology anyway, you have an inability to achieve orgasm. That sucks. So like, great, I have a life where I can't orgasm. What's the point? So a lot of these things I'm sitting here is just the cost of a lot of these medications, as far as I was doing it in my mental ledger, was getting more outweighed on the side effects than the benefits of just mental clarity or not dealing with as many suicidal thoughts. And the troubling thing for me was, even on the medication, up until the ECT treatment I received a year and a half ago, I, for 15 years, dealt with a suicidal thought at minimum once a day. So even with the medication, I was dealing with that. So I'm like, you know what? Screw it. I'll cold turkey it. I'll white knuckle my way through the worst of this stuff. I've learned enough in the intervening years on medication and going through therapy, of cognitive behavioral therapy especially, of ways that I can manage myself. And if I have to take a week where I don't get out of bed, that's what I'm going to do. And for a while I did that. And that was it the healthiest option? No. But for me, I'm like, you know what? I just didn't want to be on stuff that was jacking the rest of myself up. And I'm not just a brain, right? So I wanted to be able to live my life, and I'm stubborn in that sense. And it wasn't until I got the new diagnosis a year and a half ago of treatment-resistant depression, less because of my depression was treated well. I was the one resistant to the depressive treatment. So what would happen is I go off a medication, and then that medication would no longer work for me. So I'd have to find and take time to find a new combination of medications that would work. And for about a 4-year period, towards the end of my 20s, I found a pretty good combination, and that was fine. Limited side effects and a pretty good mental state, and okay. And then I had another depressive turn at the tail end of 2019, which led me back into the hospital. Local hospital here is Emory, which is pretty well known around the world for good doctors there, and they recommended electroconvulsive therapy, and it was those treatments that have finally, at least for now the last year and a half, I have a suicidal thought maybe once every handful of months. That's been the most. I'm still on medication, but that treatment especially was what has given me the most distance and severely reduced the intensity of those thoughts when I do have them.
That's a huge reduction, going from every day to once every few months.
Yeah.
The image I have of electroconvulsive therapy is, the classic Hollywood stereotype where you've got someone strapped to a bed and, they've shoved like a wooden block between their teeth and strapped electrodes to the head. And is that what it's like? Yeah. Is that what it's like, essentially?
No. And so I still get a trip out of this. So I'm at this place called Emory Wesleywood. So I'm in another psychiatric facility. My 6th hospitalization in 3 or 4 different hospitals in 15 odd years. I'm kind of pissed off once again. This time I was just tired. I'm like, I've done this shit before. Fine. The only thing that genuinely pisses me off about psychiatric hospitals is that the beds are intentionally uncomfortable. Um, all that is, for folks who don't know, is the idea is to give you another reason to not be in your bed. So they want you up and kind of moving around. So my personal rebellion to that system is nope, I'm staying in bed. I don't care how uncomfortable I am. But I met with a whole bunch of doctors and nurses, people with freaking medical degrees, and they all looked at me as like, we've reviewed your history. We think you could be good for electroconvulsive therapy. And I looked at a room full of people who were smarter than me and told them to fuck off.
Yeah.
And then I went back to my room. And then then the next day I'm like, you know what? They put you under general anesthesia. I can't really sleep anyway, so at the very least I'll be knocked unconscious. That's kind of what I'm going for right now. So that was my rationalization to be like, I can at least give this. I had no belief whatsoever in the efficacy of this treatment. But before you do it, there's a lot of protocol going through it, and so if anything, it gave me some novelty in my day in the hospital, which is wanting when you're in the hospital. There's not a lot that changes, and so they showed you a video, and the one they showed was Hollywood's depiction of it in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, and or also what they did. In a Beautiful Mind, where they used to just strap electrodes to your head, strap yourself to the bed, and fucking zap you with, a handful of volts, not a lot there, and you'd suffer a grand mal seizure. And they would do that multiple freaking times, even in a day, because they're like, this is doing something, we don't know what, but let's just keep doing it, and hopefully good things happen. The treatment for that has gotten much more standard, much more humane, much safer, and just much overall, just less devastating to the body. So what happens now is they show you this video of like what it used to be. Like, we don't do this anymore. Just FYI. You start off with a battery of memory tests to establish a baseline memory, because there can be a risk for not long-term memory loss, but short-term memory loss. So you answer some of the same questions before you do each session, and generally it's 10 to 12 sessions spread out over about 6 weeks. And so I started off after passing the battery stuff and the physical and all that kind of stuff. They're like, all right, we're going to roll with you. Here we go. So they take me up like the second or third floor, and I meet with the nurses who are prepping me, and so they get a mainline IV into me just for a saline solution. They do the memory things, and so I always had to say my name, what year is it, who's the president, where am I right now, that kind of thing. And then I'm in line to go into the room. And so I get pushed in the room, and there's the MD, there's another nurse, there's the anesthesiologist, and then there's I think a backup somebody in there for one of those positions. And so they roll me in, they lock the gurney down, and I'm lying back there. And it was just for this one in particular. I'm sure they do it for the other things, but it's like a dentist's office. There's like a nice painting or visual thing up top to like kind of keep you calm. So I've got a scene of the beach in front of me, and they inject you with a muscle relaxer, number one, so that yes, you're having a seizure, but it's all neurological as far as your body's concerned. So you're not flopping around. You're not going to whack somebody or something. And so they give you the muscle relaxant. Meanwhile, the nurse is setting everything up there. The doctor is reading out, what your brain waves are doing, and checking to see if you have had a seizure of good enough quality for a long enough period of time to be in their of being able to say it was effective for this treatment.
Yeah.
And then the anesthesiologist, who's my best freaking friend, he's like, all right, are you ready for the medication? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, okay, here we go. And for me, they use propofol. And I experienced that as like this awesome freaking like cool wave sort of coursing through my body. And I'm like, and best freaking feeling. That stuff is awesome. I like that drug. And then the next thing I know, I'm kind of groggy. I'm waking up and I'm in the recovery area, and I'm not strapped down to anything. And the nurse comes by and she checks me out and gives me some orange juice and a cookie. And you get like 40 odd minutes there as you just kind of like, okay, cool. And then they put me in a wheelchair and wheel me back into the ward. And I did that 3 days a week while I was in the hospital for 2.5 weeks. And then they eventually spaced that out after about 7 sessions to once a week. which I was doing while I was in an intensive outpatient program called Skyland Trail. And generally, they're like, you're probably not going to notice any significant differences in your thoughts until about the sixth or seventh session. So I'm like, all right, well, just keep that propofol running because that's a fun experience. I will enjoy, like that. That was the thing I was leading for. I'm like, just put me unconscious, I'll be happy. Um, and then, yeah, after about the eighth one, I'm noticing that I'm not in my head as much. And also, I'm noticing I'm not having as intense suicidal thinking. And then by the 10th one, the doctor's like, "How are you doing?" And I just blurted out, "I'm doing great. How are you?" Like, it was my first like interaction, just like, I feel good enough to care about how another person's doing. And after the 10th, 11th session of that it was done there. And then I'm in an IOP, um, in different group therapy sessions, learning now some skills here. But I finally, after a decade plus of doing everything I could, um, with medication and with therapy and group therapy and my own research of dealing with my brain, this treatment, which I wish I had now had sooner, I'm in the, it's about 80% effective for the people that take it, right? So it's a pretty good odds, and I'm fortunate I was in the good odds for that. The having now these thoughts that I thought I was, first off thought I'd never get to 25, and then in my 30s I'm like, I'm going to be dealing with these thoughts until I'm retired, if I make it that far. To now be 33 and have a year and a half where I forget the last time I had a suicidal thought it's still, I still get some goosebumps here. Just like, wow, I can't believe that I don't have, I could still deal with the depression. Fine. I have that. I'll work with that. But this other weight has been drastically reduced.
Yeah. No, that sounds incredible. And I suppose it being a fairly intense procedure is, yeah, just I guess that's what you needed to help get you through. But yeah, I'm glad it's working. You were talking about being hospitalized and your suicide attempts. What led you to, on each of those occasions, what led you to that point where you thought, you know what, I'm done. I don't have anything else to give to this life. What was it that brought you there?
A lot of it going back into that space of, I didn't, it boiled down to I just didn't want to be in pain that I couldn't understand anymore. And that I didn't know was serving any kind of purpose, and that I didn't know if it was ever going to end, right? So, especially in my early 20s, so it was, I think it was 23, twice when I was 23 and once when I was 26, that I attempted in my life, hanging, an overdose, and with a handgun. And so they've got progressively more lethal, in terms of what could happen to me physically, in each of those. And it, man, I was in such a numb emotional place. I was in such a guilt ridden space for, you know, I've dropped out of college now two or three times. I can't seem to hold a steady job. I'm living in my parents' basement. I'm not a productive member of society. I can't really call myself a man. Nobody's ever going to want to date me. Like, I'm just like, all these things that I'm going from a social side that are just, evidence for my continued existence isn't doing me or anyone else any good. So I've got this logical, checklist of things that's just like, yeah, you're not really worth anything here. So, that you can, you should remove yourself from this equation so other people have space to be. We don't want to waste resources on Gordon anymore, right? And then the other one is I was in so much pain, and I couldn't, even when I found a little bit of the way out of it in some effective talk therapies, in some good interactions with friends and family, with, the limited experiences I'd had with some medications, it was always lurking beneath the surface. And I knew that. And I knew that I didn't want to spend a life completely on guard 24/7 where, and not even that, like I've woken up into panic attacks. Like, so that's my brain just fucking with me. Saying like, dude, you're semi-conscious right now, and we're gonna worry about a whole nother thing. And when you're finally conscious, you're gonna have even more to worry about. Great. So it it was just an I'm done. And this is the most permanent way I can think of to get this endless thinking about horrid things to stop. And I wasn't worried about what could happen. I don't. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the afterlife. The thought of eternal darkness was very pleasant to me at the time.
Yeah, I hear that. How did you deal with so I hear people sometimes talk about things like it's such a selfish thing to do, not thinking about your family or friends, or like, how do you deal with the judgments of others, or do you deal with the judgments of others when I don't know if you've heard people say things like that, or people have said things like that to you. Is
Yeah, and it's one of those other things where, yeah, it's very different from mental illness versus it's just like, no one ever says like, how dare you develop cancer? Like, don't you think about your family and friends? Like, look at what you've putting them through. I'm like, dude, like I didn't ask for this. But because there is a volitional act in suicide, people assume that again, it's you're choosing to do this. And honestly, what it is it's the last symptom for a lot of depressives or people with mental illness that presents in that particular way. And the thing for me is, so I've been a referee for 15 odd years, so I'm kind of used to people questioning my judgments regardless. And so that helps kind of buffer those things. But I've almost never really had folks tell me just like, oh, you're being selfish or not. I read a lot about that. I mean, I've read a ton about other people's experiences and judgments that they've had there. And so part of me was that was inside of my head, just like, oh, what about your parents? What about your sister? What about your girlfriend, your friends, the people you care about? And for me, it was I didn't. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt them, right? I knew intellectually it would hurt them, but going back to what we had discussed before, there's only so far that logic will take a person in that state. I couldn't feel an emotional connection to anyone. So I knew that my parents and friends and girlfriend loved me intellectually, logically. I knew that, but I couldn't feel it. And you can't go through life not feeling that. At least that's been my experience. And it's what the father of modern suicidology, Edwin Schneidman, called it emotional tunnel vision. It's this restricting of options, number one, in terms of a person going down to suicide, but it's also emotional tunnel vision is now this inability to start feeling any kind of emotion. And it's that numbness that becomes unfreaking bearable. And it's like, so yeah, I get that. Yeah, I might get, blamed for, my parents' grief or whatnot, but understand the fact that I could only understand that at a very surface level when I was in that particular state. So it wasn't selfish, those thoughts. It was a lack of ability to connect with other people. And that, in my mind, for a social species as human beings are, that leads directly to death.
Yeah, yeah, and it sort of reminds me of a lady. I can't remember her name, but she told her experience of, so she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in her kind of late teens, early 20s, and she and her husband, she got married eventually, and they talked about the fact that, okay, so we don't have kids because while it would be great to have children, getting pregnant and all of the flux that hormones put your body through, I guess she'd gotten to the point in her life where, she'd managed to find a good balance of medication and was fairly kind of level throughout, but she didn't want to risk upsetting that with a pregnancy, and so they decided not to have kids. And as it turns out, she did get pregnant, and she talks about her experience with postnatal depression, and she said it got so bad at one point where she was sat there contemplating, and she thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll just, I'm such a drain on my husband. Like I'm no fun to be around. Like I'm such a pain in his life, and I love him so much, and I don't want to continue being a burden to him. Let me just take myself out of the equation. And then she thought, actually, but how is he going to manage with the baby all alone? And that's going to cause a lot of stress and stuff. So okay, so let me and the baby, we will go. I'll kill the baby and myself. And they said, no, but he's going to be so lonely all by himself, and what's he going to do? And she said, all of us will go. Lock the doors, wait till everyone's asleep, and just set the house on fire. And she said in her mind she had rationalized this act of taking her life, and to her that had made so much sense in the moment, and for her, taking her life was almost like the most caring thing that she could have done for her husband, because she felt as though she was such a burden for him. And I hear sometimes people who have experience suicidal thoughts talk about this idea of feeling as though they're a burden on the people around them. And so, as you mentioned, that restriction of options, it's almost, I'm doing everyone else a favor.
Yeah, so it's Thomas Joyner, who I consider now the heir to Schneidman's take on suicidality, and taking that now into our modern understanding of it. He's a professor of psychiatry in Florida, I think Florida State. So I hope I don't mess that up for any Florida listeners, because Seminoles and Gators hate each other. But the idea here is there's two things that will lead somebody into a more likely situation to attempt to end their life, and that's perceived burdensomeness, and that is the learned ability to enact self-harm. So the idea here is that, again, it's not actual burdens, it's perceived, right? It is irrational in the sense it's that emotional tunnel vision collapsing in on the person. So it's this feeling that, again, I'm wasting space, I am taking resources away from productive members of society, I am taking my existence harms other people that I care about, right? And so yes, in that sense, eliminating the harm myself makes a lot of sense in that twisted way, right? That's where logic will get you sometimes, especially when you can't feel your connection to other people. And then the learned ability to enact self-harm. So this is where a lot of suicidal fantasies come into play. This is where a lot of people, myself included, will either cut or will practice or plan out. I'm very much a planner, so for all of my suicide attempts, I planned out almost minute by minute kind of what I was going to wind up doing up to the final action. And that it's psychological rehearsal, but it's also and attuning yourself to the pain that you might finally be experiencing here. So the idea of, in Joiner's sense, of cutting yourself and slicing your wrists is pretty terrifying for everybody, right? We know that shit's going to hurt, right? And you got to cut deep, right? So how do you then work yourself up to that shallow cuts somewhere else, right? And so you build then that ability to enact more lethal harm to yourself later on. And so those two things together are the danger zone for somebody trying to, or somebody experiencing that. It's according to Joyner and still the latest research, those are the two things you need. You need to be perceiving yourself as a burden to those you care about, and you have to be able to experience, you have to acclimate yourself to a degree of pain that you need to make a lethal life-ending decision. And a lot of what I'm trying to do, and a lot of what suicide prevention advocates do now, is helping people realize that who are in that space so they can go ask for help themselves. But more than likely, it's the people around them being aware of what the signs are for somebody who is going down that path mentally, because there's a lot of very consistent behaviors that people follow that it's a pretty good bet that they're going to try to do something, or if not, they're just really going in that direction, and we'd like to spare them that future pain if we can.
Yeah, I was gonna ask actually what are the things that if you should look out for? So if you have someone in your life who is going through depression or having suicidal thoughts, what are the things that you should look out for to, I guess, try and help keep them safe?
So one of the more common ones, and this is again, these are averages across populations, but again, we're all humans, so we break down in very similar ways. In this, in terms of just the generalities, is a marked change in behavior, right? So this is just like somebody who normally does a thing, and then they're doing something way off from what they usually do, right? That is probably the first very obvious sign that something is weird. In my case, I'm very much introverted, so it's like there are some people on my phone list who I don't have the permission to ignore their calls, so to speak. We've developed that. Other people I let stuff go to voicemail, but for very small people on my speed dial, I've gotten to a point in my life where I owe them now to pick up the phone and say how I'm doing. Um, but other folks, especially in the bipolar world, go manic, and so now they're racing in that space. So again, it's a sharp departure from the baseline, from normality. That is kind of the first thing that'll ping somebody's radar. And then the other one for depressives, especially, I notice this in my own world, but also I've been in God knows countless numbers of group therapy sessions, and it's very interesting being in a room full of depressed people because we all very much act the same way. We're hunched over. We're very slow in our delivery of words, partly because we're having difficulty finding the right words in our own head and then getting them out of our mouth. It's that amount of energy. Like our body's fighting the depression at the moment. So it's like we've got a lot of stuff physiologically and in our brains that we don't have a lot of bandwidth for communication. And so you start seeing this slow speech, not slurred, just slow speech, like just taking effort just to talk. And then you start seeing this crunching over, and that is a body language thing, which you start seeing in folks who I do a lot of talks to coaches about like how they can ID the morale of their team through that body language. You start seeing somebody crunching over and bringing their hands over their chest. It's kind of like a little bit of a physical hug. The idea here is that these are unconscious things that we do as primates. All of our soft, squishy internal organs that are very critical to our long-term well-being, if those get damaged, our chances of survival drastically drop. And so even when we're depressed, when we're under threat, we tend to crunch in and carry a weight and protect those vital soft organs. So you go into a group therapy session with 15 odd depressed people, and you'll see a whole bunch of folks curled up in their chairs, just sitting there, and that's one of those things of it's a comforting space to be in. You're giving yourself a little bit of a hug here, which is why now we have freaking weighted blankets, and I love my weighted blanket because there's a sense of comfort in that little bit of pressure, and it's a safety thing. So you start noticing again marked depression, marked change in behavior. Excuse me, slower speech, laborious speech, and then the body language of somebody curling up, not being able to move very, seemingly just like again, there's a lot of weight there, but that protecting of the core of their body is a very heavy thing. And then the other one that kind of goes on there, but I think it goes without saying with a lot of things, is sleeping not at all or way too much. Like that's another sign that just like something's up and we need to get some professionals involved.
You mentioned before that you were an atheist. Did I see? I think I caught a glimpse of a tattoo on your arm. Is that a depiction of Dante's
Ha! You got it right away already. Even from a glimpse, I'm thrilled you got that one, man. Sweet.
Oh wow. How it seems a little bit of an odd choice. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's so I'm a huge. I've always been a big reader since I was a kid. That is, and for me, it's like I escape in fantasy and sci-fi and historical fiction and fiction because that it gets me out of my own head for sure. But I was raised Catholic and then Methodist, and so you get introduced to certainly the teachings of the Bible. But then as I went into college, you start getting into more now the non-canonical things behind certain Western religions. And I was always interested in myths and Greek myths especially, but just how people tried to explain things that they didn't know. And that makes sense. Okay, cool. And Dante's Inferno, I read the Divine Comedy every year because I find it just fascinating. And Dante Alighieri is just such a visceral writer. You just can't help but experience what he wants you to experience. And as a writer, I try to do that. It's something I don't always hit, but that's something to aspire to. But I have on my right arm it's a cover up originally on that big black spot in the back. The Wood of the Suicide, which is the seventh circle of hell in Dante's Inferno. And then I have some other scenes, King Minos, Dante and Virgil walking through Cossack, Cerberus, and a few quotes, not from Dante's Inferno, but just some things that I like from philosophy. But The Wood of the Suicide is, for me, just a fascinating insight into how people perceived where suicides went in the afterlife in the Christian religion. And for those listeners who don't know, if you willingly gave up the gift of your physical body that God gave you, you didn't get that in the afterlife. You were reborn, so to speak, as a sapling. You would grow in a tree without a body, condemned to an eternity of silence, unless a harpy came by and broke your branches off, in which case you would bleed and you would be able to allowed to speak only as long as you were bleeding.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, you're like, holy, what the hell? And so the interesting thing about that is, so all the other circles of hell, Dante kind of goes into them, and he's very apprehensive early on, but as he goes further in, he gets a little bit more just, kind of gung-ho about, like, these are sinners, screw them, they deserve this kind of stuff. He gets to the seventh circle. We're pretty deep into hell at this point in his story. And he goes into this thing, and he's hearing these, like, howls, but he doesn't see anybody. And he looks to Virgil, and he's like, dude, what's up? And Virgil's like, you wouldn't even believe me if I told you. Go over there and break that branch off that tree. And Dante's like, what? He's like, just trust me, go over there. And he breaks it, and the first thing the tree does is, dude, I'm already in enough pain. And Dante is, it's like, it's one of the weirdest moments in literature that I've come across, where it's just this existential moment of crisis. And it's stunning to me. And even Dante is just taken aback by the punishment here. And then it goes even further. After Judgment Day, where everyone else who is a Christian and believes in the risen Christ goes and lives in paradise for the rest of eternity, those suicides, after Judgment Day, their former bodies are hung on their branches. So now they get to watch people in paradise while looking at the thing they threw away. And I'm like, holy cow. And so I go with just, like, I've written some things about this, of just like, imagine believing that was actually true, that was actually what was going to happen to you, which people did. This was a belief. It's how people understood hell well after the 13th century. And you still try to kill yourself, or you do. Like, imagine how much pain that must be in your present moment, that you're okay with that because that's known, but you can't deal with the unknown in the present and that pain. I show that as just how horrifying depression can really be. But I have, yes, as an atheist, I have a very intricate depiction of hell and the afterlife on my arm, primarily as a reminder to myself of where my brain used to be. A lot of delusional thinking in my mind, and believing things that didn't have a rational basis and stuff, just because it felt good or because somebody else had told it to me. And that led me to some rather improper and unhealthy conclusions. But then the other bit is, this is my depression made visible. This is my way of making my mental illness visible. So when somebody's like, hey, what's with that semicolon tattoo, or what's with this? I'm like, oh, it's the Wood of the Suicides. I used to be suicidal. And like, oh, well, even complete strangers are like, well, I'm glad you're still here. And I'm like, thanks, man. I appreciate the good vibes. But this is my way of having my invisible illness out there. And in the format that I control, because it's like, I just love Dante's Inferno. I love how it that story. It's fascinating to me because it's a fascinating look into how the human mind thinks about things, and, and and absorbs stories, and it just gives us insight into how we think we really are, and that's why I have it on my arm.
That's incredible, actually. This and quite harrowing as well. This idea that you would risk eternal damnation because life was so unbearable, and I think that really kind of drives home just how difficult this, dealing with depression and suicidal thoughts can be.
We There's a great I think it's one of those things that's been said so many times that the original author or speaker of the words isn't, but the quote goes, "Human beings prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty," and that just drives home for me, where I just like that's where a lot of suicidal thinking comes from, because this we don't know why we're having this, and we don't know when it's going to end, and even an eternity of living as a tree and bleeding from frickin' harpies, at least that's known, so it can be understood, and even in some ways accepted, because it's like, yeah, well, dude, I threw away this gift. This is what I deserve, and you can understand that. But when you're living that, you can't, and that is an added weight to an already nearly unbearable weight.
Goodness. Um, I think that probably is a good kind of segue into this idea of mental agility and the distinction between mental agility and mental toughness that you've spoken about. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Certainly. So I started mental agility about a year after the story came out in Lacrosse magazine called "Lacrosse Saved My Life: A Story of Friendship and Survival," and this is where I got more into, at least in Maryland where I lived at the time, the suicide prevention advocacy work from a couple of organizations there. And I'm like, I'd like to. I've always been writing in some form or fashion, so let me try to start writing a little bit about my experiences. And mental agility was the thing that I gravitated toward, because I've been an athlete all my life. I've been in sports all my life. I'm a referee now, and the biggest thing I've found from student athletes especially is this intense pressure to perform. That's a natural thing. Some of that's built in to those folks. Some of that is parental expectations as well. But then this inability then to admit any kind of weakness. And then when I got into refereeing, it was all about, hey, you got to be mentally tough. You have to thick skin. Develop a rhinoceros hide, because you're going to get a lot of stuff thrown your way that you're going to have to deal with. And I thought that was the way to go about doing it. And what I try to make a big distinction here is I don't discount grit and perseverance, right? I'm not saying those things are bad. But we've as a society, as a Western society, in my mind especially, have focused so solely on the toughness piece of that for young people especially. And what I say is, mental toughness is great when you already know what you're doing, right? So nobody has to tell uh, nobody has to tell a professional athlete. Roger Federer does not need to be told anything more about tennis than what he already freaking knows, right? So he can be mentally tough. He's got all the other skills needed. If he just all he needs additionally is perseverance in a tough match, probably, right? And he's got the skills to back that up. But an 11-year-old in their first tennis match, it needs more than just grit and perseverance. They need the skills and the ability to adapt and figure this stuff out. And we've gone way overboard in the toughness piece of it, in my estimation. So mental agility, to me, is an in addition to, not a replacement of. It's this ability to mentally recognize, oh no, a train is coming. I can either kind of stand here and let it hit me, or I can move off to the side. And I can let it pass. I can find a different route around. I can find a way to shut it down. But it's all these ways of, for me, looking at mental illness as an opponent, trying to strategize methods around it, so I'm not getting constantly hit in the face by this thing and trying to make decisions. And I liken this to being in a boxing ring, or the UFC octagon or something like that, of just saying, like, you make poor decisions when you're getting hit in the face. You just do. Like, I used to kickbox. This is what happens. And The idea for mental agility is you need to be able to bob your head out of the way, find a better angle so you're not getting attacked, and so you can choose the most optimal path forward. And so the idea here being is if you do that enough, you don't have to rely on solely mental toughness for the entire fight. You now have reserves that you can pull from when you really, 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 really need it. And that, when I speak to student athletes especially, resonates with them because it's like, yeah, this is, I'm not saying you're not going to have to be mentally tough. I'm saying there's some skill and strategy behind this that we have glossed over a good bit in our development of young athletes, but that professional athletes do like the biggest thing right now is sports psychology at the professional levels in all sports because they've figured out all the other stuff. This is the only other place where they can find a competitive edge. So let's try doing that for people who are younger, but also in our personal lives because we don't have to stand there getting punched in the face by life all the time. We can find a way to move a little bit.
Mm. No, I like that a lot actually, and especially as you said that toughness isn't bad, but it's certainly not the only tool to overcome difficulties and challenges by, and this idea of kind of attacking. You mentioned before, I think on your blog about attacking your depressed thoughts by gaining mastery over them and feeding into that whole idea of mental agility.
Yeah, it's a recognition that this is for me. It's one of those things where, and some folks have gotten here, and I'm I believe them on that sense. I can never go so far that I'm friends with my depression. We have a much more amicable relationship. We share the same space in the head, so we kind of got to give that. But I go back to a quote by the poet Rumi, who says like treat. So this is the interesting thing on my end of just a little bit of maybe Middle Eastern but Eastern philosophy and belief to Western side is the idea here. Western side is to just grit it out, hold on, get through the worst of it, and come out and be successful. Right? We take that in terms of how they break horses in the West. Like there's every Wild West movie has a scene where the guy has to break a horse and dominate it and now ride off into the sunset. Okay, in Mongolia, that's not how they break horses. They take a super long rope, they put a little loop around the wild horse, and then they just take a couple inches over to a post. And then the horse is like, dude, this is great. I got all the space in the world. And then they pull a couple more inches. And the horse is like, dude, this is great. I got all the space in the world. And after a day, the horse is chilling next to the guy with the rope and is totally calm, which is what you wanted to do. And you expended almost no energy. You just took more time, right? Rumi goes for another thing for thoughts of treat your thoughts as honored guests. Like I used to look at my depression as we're going to have a knockout, drag down fight every freaking day. That's exhausting, right? Rumi goes a different way. Treat your thoughts as you would any guest into your home. They come in, you welcome them, say hello, offer a beverage. If they're a dick, they're like, okay, door's open, feel free. If they ruin your house, okay, cool, I know how to clean. Doors open, you can head that direction. The idea here is that you give your thoughts, all of them, a degree of respect. And oddly enough, over time, it's been my experience that even the most evil sense of depression thoughts that I have given me a different sense of respect in return. It's weird. It's for me. It's mental agility is a blending now more of a more complete and holistic sense of human philosophy that is not just I'd say westernized, but certainly in my experience, Americanized of just be tough and grit this stuff out because life is hard, get a helmet. It's like, no, we're actually pretty smart people. If we use our noggins in a way, we can reduce some human suffering here. And that's mental agility is the way I can try to alleviate some pain and some future pain for people.
No, I like that a lot actually, and I haven't thought about that concept as kind of treating your thoughts as guests, and I guess responding to them based on how they respond to you. So yeah, no, it's really interesting one. I have a last question for you. I want to ask about how do you manage your symptoms? How do you kind of, I guess, make sure, or as best you can, that you are okay and you can get through each day, or do you do you make sure that you are you're okay? Like what does your routine look like for being the best version of yourself?
So one of the things to help, I'm a data hound. So this is a fairly simple app called iMood Journal, and I track my mood multiple times over the course of a day, at least once, usually three times, and that gives me a nice average of the entire day. And then I can start looking back on it and be like, well, what precipitated? And you can tag behaviors and things, so you can start seeing like, okay, this kind of thing happened, and I was feeling really good. This thing happened, and I'm feeling not so good. What's going on here? And so that gives me some data to kind of modify my future days to be more on the feeling good side, right? Like this year started off pretty badly because I got my front lip bit in half by a Rottweiler.
Oh wow. My
So my
goodness.
mood was pretty low for about a week, understandably so. But it's like I've had a fairly stressful start to the new year in that I started a brand new job. I'm low man on the totem pole. I'm learning a new trade. But my mood has been consistently high, primarily because I switched jobs to be better off for my mood and my brain. So I work in the utility industry now, and I'm outside. I'm moving. I work 4 days a week, 40 hours, Monday to Thursday. I'm constantly having to focus on very simple tasks in front of me, but are important for safety in an electrical and energized environment. But also, I now have time to do the other things that I want to during the rest of my week. So I got time to do my reading. I got time to watch a cool talk or a documentary, or just to veg out on Netflix and watch Lucifer or something. I've got time to write, do podcast things here. I do talks. So whether it's running stuff on my website at mentallyagile.com or just thinking about an article I want to write while digging a hole, that's elevating my mood. And then the other bit is really recognizing when am I tired or am I depressed? That's a question I ask myself fairly regularly. Like today, I am beat to hell physically. I worked 2 weeks straight because we were on storm. I ran two lacrosse games over the last 2 nights. I am physically beat. And in my younger days, I would have gone like, "Oh, I'm depressed because I don't have energy right now." But now it's framing that of just like, no, you've done a lot over the last 2 weeks. You have permission to do very little today. That's my plan. Right. This conversation is the most energetic thing I have to worry about doing today, and that's it. Cool. Um, but a lot of it is just for me. It's an awareness factor, and that's what I try to get younger people to realize, and their parents as well, of saying like, look, a lot of the problems that I dealt with was not understanding the precipitating causes of some thoughts and some behaviors that I would do, and then only doing like one. Like I can stay in bed all day even now. That's fine. I like that. I'll cocoon up and be it's comforting. I love that. But I can't do that for more than a day. I've got obligations and I got a life I want to live. But you have to have a reason for getting out of bed, and it can't be for other people in my estimation. It's got to be something that gets you going.
I completely agree with you, actually, especially the whole thing about moving around. You mentioned before the lacrosse saved your life. I really feel as though cycling did the same for me. I, I think part of the appeal to me as well around cycling was just, feeling in every other area of my life restricted and unable to exercise any agency or being imprisoned. But you get out on a bike and you go anywhere you want. And it gives you some time to kind of process your thoughts and work through some of the angst. And also, I guess instead of beating yourself up mentally, you can do it physically in a healthy way. So
Yes, I would say to anybody listening, if those are thoughts you're dealing with, is try to find some way to transfer that into the physical, and you're going to maybe not right then, but you're going to find better returns on that investment than you are for. Like I used to punch the top roof of my car when I was in an anxious mood and stuff like that. That's painful. That's hurt. That's not what we're talking about here. But if you can find any kind of outlet that has some type of physicality involved in it, cycling being your thing, lacrosse officiating, now my work being mine, you increase your chances of thinking the thoughts that you would much rather have.
indeed. Indeed. Gordon, thank you so much. I think that is, I think that's everything. Was there any last bits that you wanted to add before we close off?
Just I'm searchable. You can Google me. My website is mentallyagile.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You're more than welcome to message me. Corsetti at mentallyagile.com if you've got questions on things. But anybody can check out my site. I'm always looking for new ways. I'm a guinea pig myself in treatments, so if you find some interesting things like this helps with depression, I'm usually probably going to try it out and write about it and really see what happens. But this is my why for getting out of bed now, and this is why I like to have these kind of conversations, because every little bit of it again gives people some better explanatory power around their experiences and helps get people out of the dark.
See how rewind when we rewind.